All right, we're doing a bunch of vids here. This is the sweet spot here. Earlier today, we were driving around doing some stuff, and I'm like, the Indians, okay, the Native Americans, as you call them. Why an Indian wouldn't want to be called an American, which is like a pejorative, in my opinion, at this point. I don't understand, but I understand, the semantics, the things like that. Like I said, I'm a retroactive European, so. But we were talking about the what do you call it? The Aboriginal people, okay? The Indians that lived in this area. Now, this area that we're in, Pittsburgh, right? This was not even Pennsylvania during some of the tumultuous wars during the French and Indian Wars, and then the British attempts to take Fort Duquesne, which is a little east, which is like a little bit east of here. Um, Essentially, what was the makeup here of what Indian tribes were here? I had mentioned the Delaware, obviously the French and Indian War. The Delaware was decided to turn on the English after the French gave them a better deal. And you had the different tribes. Where, like I mentioned to you today, where were the Iroquois when the British were getting their asses kicked? I thought the Iroquois were loyal to the British. Where were they? And I'll have you explain that. Who were the Indians involved, and why were the Iroquois not, like, helping the British, fight the in this area where the French and the Indians were, the French allied Indians.
Okay, so for the entire 1600s and into the 1700s, there were a series of Indian wars called the Beaver Wars. It was basically fighting over fur trapping territory, so that the Indian warriors could get the furs and trade them to the French and the English for guns, shot, and powder,
Right.
which again would make them more powerful in warfare. One of the reasons why the Delaware were so feared all the way to the Pacific Northwest.
Oh yeah.
People knew who the hell they were in 1807 when a couple of them went out there as guides. They would guide all around the country, all the way down to Mexico. It was because they were one of the first groups of people to get guns, because they came from the area around Delaware, which was named after an English lord. He was one of the...
Well, their real name is the Lenape.
Yeah, right. So he was Lord Delaware, or whatever his name was. These guys are first East Coast Indians, but they slowly drift west. By the time that you have the French and Indian War, and there's a big battle fought here where Braddock's army is slaughtered, and Washington seems to quit himself pretty well, considering he's got to basically started the war by an aborted diplomatic mission out here. When Washington came out here with Grist, his guide, and they also had a guy with them called the Half King.
Oh yeah, that was right. Montcalm's brother.
Who also had a buddy named White Thunder. Okay. The Pittsburgh area, the area of Fort Duquesne, was really a refugee area.
Okay.
The Shawnee in earlier periods were actually spent part of the year in eastern Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia.
Oh wow.
We think of them as just Ohio Valley people. That was their last defensive position.
Okay.
Was the Ohio Valley. So all these people migrated around. The Iroquois lived in the mountainous regions of New York.
Okay, upstate.
So they had defensible terrain between the lakes and the sea. And the French had the lakes and the English had the sea. So they never really had to migrate. Now, during the French and Indian War, the Iroquois had their hands full fighting the French Indians in that area. They had to deal with the Abenaki, the Huron, and so on. Now, this area here to the Indians would be called Three Rivers. Ohio means good river. Ohio River is a way of saying good river, river.
River.
Okay.
It's a good river.
Okay. Monongahela means mudslide river.
Okay.
Allegheny River means beautiful people river.
Right.
Okay, so the beautiful people were not around in the 1740s when this war started out here. The Erie were not around anymore. Both of these people had been exterminated by the Five Nations, who later became the Six Nations.
Only the Europeans exterminated people.
The Iroquois were to other tribes in their region of North America very similar to the Athenians in ancient Greece. The Athenians exterminated 5 other nations of people. They killed all of the men and sold all the women and children.
Nice.
Okay, so, and they were a tribal society. Athens was an alliance of 10 or 12 tribes. So the 5 nations they called themselves the Five Fire Council. They were probably formed under a man named Daganoweda, okay, which means 2 rivers coming together to become one, who was the prophet of Hiawatha, who was basically the son of Thor, okay. So I suspect that might have happened around here. Okay. And this might have been an area where the 5 nations were brought together and they exterminated other people. So this could be a hunting area. These tribal people didn't think in terms of just killing everybody, then moving in and taking their stuff and then booming their population. They thought in terms of maintaining their population level and increasing their quality of life by acquiring access to hunting grounds that previously might have been somebody else's homeland. Okay, they probably have a lot in common with your current technocrats like Brill Yates that would just like to decrease the number of people and have more assets for themselves.
So now the Indians. So now we know the Delaware were running around, but the Indians who were with the French in this area when you had the British coming out here on what is now the Lincoln Highway, right? Coming out here to fight. What Indians were they? They were like they're Algonquins, right? Huron, Algonquins. They're not Iroquois.
Large groups of them you would have, and the Delaware were Algonquin people, and most of at the point of the French and Indian War, most of their tribal chiefs had Irish first and last names. The Mingos were a clearly mixed race group of people that were mixed European and a mixture of different tribes. They're very much like the Seminoles. Okay. They were a refugee confederation. Think of like a Mad Max tribe or something.
So the Mingos.
You would have the Shawnee.
And now Tecumseh was a Shawnee, right?
Yes. Okay. The Miami were really a huge tribe out in the area. And there's various Miami rivers and Miami tribes in North America. So there would be as many as a dozen tribes. The youngest men would come from furthest away. You might get all the men from the local Mingo communities or from the Delaware, but then the word would go out and emissaries would be sent to tribes, up to 1,000 miles away, and they could come for plunder and they would help out. So this was an army that had to be used now, because as soon as they got a victory, they were going to loot and they were going to leave.
They were going to leave. That's a big thing that was mentioned with both the French and the British. Was like, we win a battle or whatever, and then the battle goes on too long, and then the Indians are like, well, they're not cowards obviously, but they're like, we have to go back, and you're like, whoa,
There could have been some Cherokee. It's not clear. Because I've used all English sources, I've used very few French sources.
Yeah.
If I found a French account, I might be able to have an idea of what tribes they have. But they wouldn't even bother. You might have a Shawnee chief that would show up with men from 6 other tribes that were further west than him.
Right. And you had mentioned too how there's no interstates, there's no cars. These Indians really got around really quick. They could get from the Canadian border down to Virginia like in a week or two.
Yeah, you had so it's a combination of running and canoeing.
Right.
So you could canoe up as far as you could go, hide your canoes, run over the mountains, and then get to another batch of canoes that you had hidden over there, and then go down the river. So the speed at which people could move was pretty amazing. So that was one very accurate thing about the movie Last of the Mohicans was how quickly these guys could
It's
move.
interesting to note, not even like obviously the cities are all built on the rivers, but if you notice, if you look at the rail lines, and if you look at a lot of the older roads and interstates, they also follow the rivers. If you know, in a lot of places, especially the older ones,
Particularly the rail. The rail's
yeah,
all on there.
yeah, you notice that a lot. Like if you go up like Route 17 in upstate New York, you'll notice that it runs along the Delaware River up there. Like you never escape the river. As you go up miles and miles, even heading towards Binghamton, and you see the river like following you like a snake. It's interesting. It's interesting.
The one thing about the battle that occurred out here that I found out when I was researching Time Jacker, because I was looking for groups of English-speaking soldiers that got annihilated that you might be able to rescue if you had a time machine, rescue some of them before they got completely wiped out because they wouldn't be missed by history. I put my editor in charge of the research, and she said, you won't be surprised that of these two companies of Scottish Highlanders, that they were mostly transports, which meant convicted guys that had just been sold, and that not a whole lot of them were Scottish.
Yeah, well,
It was like, Irish, close enough. Get in here.
Well, I'll say and just one real quick thing. I want to end this vid in a little bit, right? But one real quick. Why was there so much fighting in this area? What was the importance?
This is the window to the Ohio Valley. This is, as soon as you get over, when you're coming down from the Laurel Highlands, you're crossing the Continental Divide. We are now in a different watershed.
Yeah,
all those other rivers behind us, they went to the Atlantic. These rivers go to the Gulf of Mexico. They all go to the Mississippi.
That is true.
That is, the French had the entire Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. So that's their entire trade network. They were not going to let George Washington and the Half King and this fur trapper, get a deal with the Indians in their watershed. And it was, the Pittsburgh area at the time was regarded by Pennsylvania as part of Pennsylvania and was regarded by Virginia as part of Virginia. The idea that the Virginians had a Virginia in the 1750s was Virginia, West Virginia, Western Maryland, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana.
Yeah, all right.
And Kentucky.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, that was the Virginian idea of Virginia.
Yeah, all right. Good luck.
Right. I mean, but that was the idea.
It's interesting how you mentioned everyone forgets about how important the watersheds were. Like even I didn't even know what the hell a watershed was. Like you are now leaving the Chesapeake watershed. You are now entering this watershed. You're like, well, what the hell is that? Well, what you just mentioned is where all the rivers flow to.
It's why American states and counties are the way they are.
Right.
It's why King County, which is Seattle is in, goes all the way back to the Cascade Mountains.
Right.
Okay, the rednecks cannot escape the big city because the big city has demanded that it control the source of their drinking water that's in the mountains. And that is gone for this entire continent. And this is why they would not allow the state of Franklin to be formed, because it would be an entirely landlocked. New Hampshire was, or Vermont was, that was a real iffy thing. That was a real experiment, and that didn't happen very often. The coastal provinces and states, they wanted to own the interior mountains because they wanted to own the source of their water.
Interesting. Yeah, you don't
that
think
way
about
they can
that.
control the trade with people that get away from them, that get out of their control, that get out of the
That's
city.
it. Where the water goes is
Eminent domain.
you could argue that's history runs along where the water flows.
Right.
All right. Nice.
Okay.